George, you were our eyes and ears in the courtroom today. What stood out to you?
Well, I mean, there wasn't much that was said about the gag order. It was a written opinion, and we didn't actually have the judge read it in court other than to say, I ruled 9 out of 10 for the prosecution.
Why? He didn't want to waste time?
What?
Why didn't he read it?
Because he wanted to get straight to the trial. And I think that, a lot of the stuff that we just heard about what was in the opinion, we didn't actually hear in open court. But that obviously was very, very significant because he's going to have more to say on this next week when the second round or third round, actually, of gag order violations is going to be discussed. And I think that, it's very significant that I think that he mentioned the possibility of jail. He's not going to impose it for this next series of events because it occurred before he issued this opinion. But I think he's probably, if I had to guess, he's probably going to reiterate next week when he probably is going to rule more quickly next week because these violations were of a piece of 9 of the 10 that he upheld. He's probably going to just say, that's it. The next time, at least I would do that. I think the next time you're running the risk of this is it. You've violated this like 13 times or whatever the number is going to be. And, he doesn't have to throw the guy in the clink for the entire duration of the trial. He can just say, OK, you're going to go in for a couple of hours and see how you like it. And then if you do it again, you'll go in for 4 or 5 hours and so on and so forth. And Donald Trump would be unwise to test that out. I mean, he's talking about all of his supporters. Well, even today, after he's complaining about how the supporters weren't able to get in, and there's nothing obstructing these people from getting in. There were only 5 people there. I mean, I think he grossly overstates his support against this court.
Neil, what do you think? What do you think about where this gag order is going? Could Donald Trump find himself in a timeout?
I do think so. I mean, I think the first thing to say, Steph, is just today's decision really underscores just how accustomed we are to Donald Trump's involvement in criminal proceedings. I mean, a really enormous thing happened today. A former president of the United States was held in contempt of court in a felony criminal trial. And 10 years ago, that would have been an unthinkable statement. And here it's just like another Tuesday. And I think that the judge was actually quite protective of Trump. I'm surprised, not surprised, but I think the judge should have gone further and imposed a criminal sentence and then suspended it so that he wouldn't have to serve it and could warn Trump and say, look, this is the consequence of what you will do, what you're doing, and jail is on the table next time. The warning today is something somewhat similar to it, but my fear is Donald Trump is just going to do it again. I mean, he seems totally consumed by his need to attack witnesses and to attack the prosecutor. And, indeed, if Trump didn't stay up every night tweeting about the witnesses and prosecutors, maybe he'd actually be able to stay awake during his trial.
Susan, give us a history lesson, because this is not just a payoff to cover up an extramarital affair, because the infamous Access Hollywood tape emerged 1 month before the 2016 election. Can you remind us why this has become so relevant again in this trial?
Well, that's right. I mean, you make a good point. We thought when the Access Hollywood tape appeared right before the election, and there was dramatic testimony about this in the courtroom today, that this was going to be the end of Donald Trump's presidential campaign. And that, in fact, is what the witness testified. There are some amazing text messages from 2016 in which he said, basically, Donald Trump is screwed. That's not the word he used, but this game is over. But it wasn't over. And so the legal theory of the case that's now being presented in this Manhattan courtroom is that, in fact, it was the effort to cover up these stories from emerging to the voters in 2016 that was the theory of the case. That was why Donald Trump and Michael Cohen were acting to buy Stormy Daniels' stories. That's at the heart of the case that's being presented right now. But these allegations about Donald Trump, and not just Stormy Daniels, but another woman, Karen McDougal, goes all the way back to 2011. And that's the evidence that they're hearing in the courtroom right now.
And the timeline matters because, Catherine, the jury saw this video of Trump himself denying allegations from women who publicly accused him of sexual assault after the Access Hollywood tape emerged. Watch this.
They're trying to poison the mind of the American voter. Every woman lied when they came forward to hurt my campaign.
If 5% of the people think it's true, and maybe 10% think we don't win.
How effective do you think that was?
Very effective.
For the prosecution?
For the prosecution, because first of all, Rona, the executive assistant, said that Trump had Ms. McDougal's and Ms. Daniels' contact information, and she even believed she saw Ms. Daniels in the waiting area. So his denial of knowing either of them is false. If he takes the stand, and he won't, but let's say he did, this will be a way to attack his credibility. His lawyers now can't say in summation he's never met these women. Here he is on tape, basically testifying to the jury, but in the way that the prosecution wants the jury to see him.
George, reportedly, Donald Trump is not happy with his lawyer, Todd Blanche. Todd is not following Trump's instructions, and he wants to have his own Roy Cohn, who was once a hard-charging lawyer, so hard-charging that he was eventually disbarred. Shouldn't this be a moment, I can't even believe I'm asking this, where Trump says, holy cow, I'm a criminal defendant, I better actually listen to a lawyer?
It's astonishing. I mean, he manages to create chaos wherever he goes. He manages to create chaos among his legal teams whenever he has a new legal team. I think it would be a big mistake for him to get rid of Blanche. I mean, Blanche didn't exactly cover himself with glory in the argument about the gag order, but it wasn't Blanche's fault. It was basically Blanche was stuck out there defending the indefensible thanks to Donald Trump. I mean, it's Donald Trump's fault, I think. And today, you know, Blanche is being put in this impossible position. He spent a lot of time cross-examining that bank witness, the bank witness from First Republic. And it was really, really quite pointless. It was just a lot of rehash of the direct because I'm guessing, speculating, that the reason why there was this lengthy, pointless cross-examination was to make Donald Trump happy. But the fact of the matter is, the question, the cross I would have asked would have been like 3 questions. You never talked to Donald Trump. You don't know what Donald Trump told Michael Cohen to do. You have no basis to conclude that Donald Trump told Michael Cohen to lie to you and to the bank about what these companies and these payments were for. And that should have been the cross.
When he fires Todd Blanche, he might look to hire you. Neil, what do you think?
Don't think so.
Yeah, no, I agree with George. I mean, first of all, I think everyone, including Donald Trump, should have access to a great lawyer. It makes the system better. And I think it's very important for someone like Trump to have a lawyer who's independent enough to tell his client when he's over the line, as he's been on, for example, violating the gag order. I don't know Blanche, but he has, as George is describing, a really almost impossible task. I mean, Donald Trump is any lawyer's client from hell. I mean, he has a lot of strong opinions, he has a lot of wrong opinions, and neither of those attributes lend themselves to a helpful legal defense, which is why you see sooner or later every lawyer, or almost every lawyer that's worked for Donald Trump, seems to be like under indictment, like Eastman or Jeffrey Clark or Rudy Giuliani, or they quit. I mean, just today, Steph, another law firm, LaRocca Hornick, which had represented Trump for a long time, sought to withdraw from their case, representing Trump. Earlier, Joe Tacopina did. I mean, the list goes on and on.